Right, so we finished early medieval Europe around the year 1000 with a map of what is now Europe, right? We'd expanded from the Mediterranean, now we have Europe, and we had towns all the way from Dublin in Ireland to Kiev in what is now Ukraine, um, Oslo in Norway, Syracuse in Sicily. Right? We have Europe with towns and kingdoms. Christianity has spread through. And what we get now that we've created Europe through a lot of, as you can see, in chaos and invasions and raids and wars, but also this constant attempt to regenerate the Roman Empire. But now we've got this big place, this Europe with towns and agriculture. We're actually going to really accelerate the growth and change. So if the period from, say, the fall of the Roman Empire to roughly 1000 AD is the creation of Europe, the next few centuries are going to be where Europe takes off, where Europe becomes a thriving, prosperous, dynamic economy and culture and civilization. And so what we're going to start off with on the slideshow that I have is the European takeoff. And we'll look at the economic boom that's going to underlie all of the changes and developments and growth. So I'm going to go to the slide that says agriculture. And what we're going to have here is some development of some crucial technologies. These kingdoms have arisen in Germany and Eastern Europe and Russia and elsewhere that have really heavy clay soils, and the more southern Mediterranean oriented ways of ploughing are not as effective in the heavy clay soils of northern and central Europe, for example, and Eastern Europe. And so there are some technologies that evolve to deal with these more challenging soils that are actually going to not just be able to plow, but these developments actually massively increase productivity. For example, you have the heavy plow, which is a plow with metal cutting blades and a mold board which turns over the clay. So you cut the clay as it's pulled and it turns the clay over, and you can plow a field with this very cleverly designed heavy plow with its curves and cutting blades. The heavy plow is increasingly during the period going to be pulled by horses rather than the traditional oxen. Horses are actually stronger and walk slightly faster than oxen, and that'll be figured out by the development of the horse collar, which you see on the bottom left picture. A horse needs to pull from its shoulders, so they come up with a horse collar, which is a leather area around there. So when you connect horses to a heavy plow, you have a very efficient animal that pulls this very efficient plow, and you can increase massively your productivity in terms of how much land you can plow in a given amount of time. And more land means more grain. And what they do, now these aren't an invention, may also have been around for many, many centuries. But what the Europeans do, and this is a key hint that we're going to see time and time again, this is not a slave economy. There are some slaves, very few. The Roman Empire, huge centralized empire, latifundia full of slaves and so forth, right? And it's all fragmented and broken up. And these smaller localities and economies and societies can't have a big slave-based economy. And what they're evolving, and this is so key, is when you need to produce more things, instead of bringing in more slaves, the Europeans have the attitude of, what technology can we do to produce, right? We don't have the slave labor, so to produce more, we need technology. And this is a solution that we'll see beginning in the Middle Ages, the idea of using technology to increase productivity and to solve problems. And of course, that is an important part of what we call modern civilizations, right? The idea of technological solutions. It's starting here in the Middle Ages. So you have more grain. And how do we grind this grain? Well, instead of getting more people to sit there and hand grind it, you massively produce mills, windmills, water mills. The countryside's full of mills grinding all of this grain. So we have technological solutions, right, even to plowing, and technological solutions to increasing the rate of production of grain. And so what we get with these technologies is a lot more land being plowed and a lot more food available, a lot more agricultural products available. So let's go to the next slide. So we now have agricultural surpluses. In other words, people are growing more food than they strictly need to eat. And some of that goes into raising population, right? You have more food, more kids can survive to adulthood, more adults are better fed, your population increases, which gives you, right, bigger villages with more workers, more bigger towns, right? Your population growth to a degree increases the productivity of your society and economy, more people making and doing more things. But also, these surpluses can be sold in markets, right? If I'm a peasant and I have a little bit extra surplus, I can go to the market and sell 2 dozen eggs and whatever I have surplus and three hens, right? I can sell it, which gives the peasants a little bit better standard of living. Not only do they have more food, but they actually can sell a little bit, make a little money, and buy a few better things. There's a little bit of a better standard of living. But what's really key is with the rise of markets, and what you get is, right, not only the growth of these old Roman towns. Remember, Roman towns were originally administrative centers to administer, right, the old tribal areas, tax them, pay for the army. Now, those old Roman towns, which had lost that administrative function, so sort of stagnated, are now becoming marketplaces. They're no longer administrative centers, they are marketplaces. And even more importantly, right, there are huge amounts of areas where there were never Roman towns, right? If you're looking outside of the old Roman Empire in Germany and Scandinavia and Eastern Europe and Russia, they're brand new towns that are being founded around the new markets, okay? And even in areas where there were Roman towns, there are new towns being founded because the Roman towns were set up to administer areas, but we need market towns in various places too. So there's literally hundreds of new towns being founded around Europe, around these new markets where people are buying and selling surplus goods. And some people even specialize in production. I'm simply going to grow rye here so I can sell it to these guys who are going to make rye bread, for example. So we're getting, right, a growing commercial economy based on these agricultural surpluses. And this isn't, and this is a commercial society, right? These are individuals making surpluses, buying and selling. This isn't a centralized Roman economy where massive slave plantations and money goes to the patrician class and to the imperial army and so forth. This is a very decentralized, localized system, not the centralized Roman system. It's a very, very different world. So we're getting the growth of towns, even new towns, villages expanding, and so forth. So quite a boom. Next slide is knights and nobles. And what here, right, is point out that, remember knights, they used to be the militaries and they built the castles to defend the locality, and now they're the local sort of lord, right? These are the guys that own the villages, right? They're the local landowners. They're the ones often, as well as nobles who control, huge territories under the king, they're the ones setting up the market. Since they're the landowners, they're the ones saying, oh, look, if we have all these people trying to find a place to buy and sell, but there's no Roman town near here. Boom, I'm going to put on my land right here. Here's some land, rent these houses. Here's a market. Here's a new town. The knights, right? The guys we think of running around in armor and swords, which they do, right? They're fighters running around in armor and swords. They're also businessmen. Like, I can make more money in my territory if I had a marketplace. So they're smart businessmen too. So they make money from rents from houses around the market, right? They make money from renting out stalls in the market. And of course, they make money also, the knights, from the increased productivity of the peasants on their land. They can increase the rent on the more productive land. And so they are making more money from this commercial society, partly just from squeezing out more rents, but partly from creating marketplaces and making money off those. And you can see that with a higher standard of living. Instead of some guy living in a wooden hall, you begin to get even small-sized stone castles, and they're living a much nicer lifestyle in these buildings. So they're getting the wealth as they benefit from this commercial economy. They're profiting from it. And to give you a good example, there's the word scutage. The tradition, remember, of a relationship between a lord and a vassal was a knight was supposed to fight for his lord for so many days a year. In exchange, he had protection from his lord, right? That lord-vassal relationship. The knight now is so busy running his lands and territories, he doesn't always want to go off to fight. He's like, no, I need to run my marketplace and make sure that my land is growing profitable barley and beans and so forth. And I need to get rents from these guys, right? He's running a business. And so what he'll do, what evolves is, instead of me going away to fight for my lord when he summons me, I will pay a tax. I'll pay scutage, which comes from scuta or a shield. It's a shield tax. The number of me and the number of soldiers I'm supposed to produce, instead I will pay money, certain amount per person, to the lord as scutage. That way I can stay home, run my business, not fight, and then the lord can use that money to hire professional fighters. And we get knights who are professional fighters. They don't care about running markets and rents. They're the professional fighters. And other knights are like, no, I'm running my territory. I'm not a professional fighter. So we begin to get the vassals paying, some of them paying scutage, and then other ones paid to be professional soldiers. So the sort of separation within knights, if you like, of the more professional soldiers from the more just landowning class. So sort of a change in vassalage. So, and then, but really, definitely, they are part of this commercial economy. They're benefiting from it, profiting from it, participating in it. Let's go to the next slide, which is towns old and new. As I mentioned, we have expanded markets in the old Roman towns, and then either new towns in areas where there was no Roman town, or new towns even in old Roman provinces where Roman towns were too few. So expanded markets, new towns. Again, many of these are under the control of a landowner, which might be a knight. It might be a monastery. Ironically, monasteries are often found as markets, because monasteries, this Christian where the monks are supposed to be out here praying peacefully away from everybody. They got a lot of land around the monastery. It's been donated to them for the upkeep of the monastery. Some of them say, we'll put a market outside the gates and make some money off that. It's too worldly. That's kind of corrupting. We can get into corruption of the church later, definitely. But monasteries, founding markets, which become towns, and you end up with a monastery surrounded by a town that they own the market in. Not a good thing. But knights, nobles, monasteries, creating markets and becoming basically the chief landlord of. Sometimes a market doesn't take off, it just becomes a village with a market. Some of them become fairly successful towns. But what happens is the merchants, The merchants are the richest traders in town. You've got your various craftsmen, which we'll talk about later, right? Your craftsmen who are, right, your carpenters and your weavers and potters, and they're making stuff and buying and selling in the market. But merchants are people who buy and sell trade over long distances. It might be regional, like from Paris. There's a merchant who trades between Paris and Marseille, right? Marseille's on the Mediterranean coast. So he does the long distance trade, and that's much more lucrative than selling a few pots locally. Or even internationally, where maybe there's a guy who's going back and forth between London and Paris, for example. But these merchants are becoming very wealthy as this economy is growing and there's more and more things being traded. I'll talk about big trade networks later as well. But these merchants are like, they're under the control of whoever owns the town. And whoever owns a town, a knight, a monastery, a noble, they're making the money. They're getting the rents and the fees from the market, and they're sort of controlling it. And the merchants who are very, very, very wealthy, they want to run things themselves. They want the town to run itself and not just for the profit of this landowner. And so what you get is usually working through the king, and usually involving exchange of a lot of money. The merchants paying the king, or the merchants may be paying the landowner, usually both. And what you get here is the merchants want to incorporate the town, make it into a corporation, right? An incorporated town is a town that has its own government, corporation body, okay? And they want a charter of incorporation, which would be given to them by the landowner and accepted by the king. And then they would become a self-governing town under the king. I mean, right, the king is over everybody, but it would no longer be under whoever it is. Now, sometimes the landlord, the lord, doesn't give it up. It's too lucrative. And I'm like, no, I'm holding this town. And even if you want to throw a riot, which does happen, there are riots when the merchants and craftsmen find that the landlord says, no, I'm holding on to this. I'm in charge. I'm making the profit. Riots and all sorts. But and sometimes the violence is enough that they'll say, okay, fine, give me some money and I'll give you a charter. Other times it's peaceful negotiation and they get a charter. And what happens in the Charter of Incorporation, accepted by the king, so he's now the lord, and the town is his vassal, right? It's basically his vassal. And they have a charter, which is the same sort of rights that a knight or noble gets. The corporation, the town government, which would be a mayor and the councilman, those terms go back to the Middle Ages, a mayor and councilman who are elected by the citizens of the town. Remember our term citizen, right? A male with a certain amount of property, usually, right, gets to participate in government and gets to vote. This is like going back to the ancient Roman and Greek roots. And now these towns, but there's hundreds and hundreds of them all over Europe, not just a clump in Greece or a few in Italy or wherever. Okay, this is happening. So the citizens get to vote for the council and the mayor and get to participate in government. And they can tax in order to pay for the infrastructure of the city and defense and so forth. The town will have its own court, just like a noble or knight does, that's taking care of the lesser crimes, major crimes stored under the king's court. They're permitted to have the militia to defend the city. So it's very much the same feudal rights. A town is not separate from the feudal system. Same feudal rights as a knight or noble to do these things. But it is a vassal of the king rather than, although occasionally there might be a vassal of a noble in some areas. But it fits into the feudal system. But instead of a single person, right, a knight or noble who has these rights, the Charter of Incorporation embodies these rights into a town in its town government. And so we have these towns, and that means that the merchants and the citizens can run the town and the market for their benefit rather than for the profit of a landowner. And many of these towns continue then to grow and expand. I wouldn't call them a democracy, right? It's citizens tend to have a certain amount of property, just like in many of the Greek city-states. And in order to be on the council or the mayor, you had to be, fairly high up, one of the merchant or relatively wealthy classes. So it's sort of a cross, because there are a fair number of citizens. It's not strictly an oligarchy where just a few guys run it, but it's not strictly a democracy where all the citizens vote. So it's some blend between, depending on which city you're in, as to how much participation citizens have. Varies across Europe. There's a lot of them. But we have now the rise of towns all the way across Europe, not only economically, but also now as political entities. Okay, so, all right, so 2 slides left. The economy, I mentioned citizens. I'm on towns and society now. I mentioned citizens, so citizens, here we are, that word going through. The citizens, it is a household economy, right? This is not the modern economy where people typically go to work in a large workplace. You work out of your household. And each householder, if they're a master at their craft, they are a member of a guild. Now, guild it's for masters. They have employees. You might have not a bunch. Each master may have anywhere from 0 to 3 or 4 what are called journeymen, and maybe a couple of apprentices. Apprentices are trainees, journeymen are paid labor, skilled labor. And then the master is running, but it's out of his house. And that master is a member of a guild. So it's not a union for workers, because the journeymen are also part of the guild. They just don't have voting rights. So a guild is designed to further the prestige and respectability of the members of the guild. So how do you do that? Well, you make sure that the people provide a good product at a fair price. And you ensure quality control, and you ensure fair dealing. Because if people see that the weavers produce amazing cloth for a fair price, and they're all treating with you fairly, right, then the Weavers Guild is considered very respectable, and the weavers have a good status in the town, because everybody says they are honest and good men making a good product. So the guild, so this economy, this household economy, right, 1, you're working out of your house. 2, you want to make a profit. You want to make a living, but you're not trying to make a living in a way that hurts other weavers. It's not me versus them. The guild works together. Hopefully all of us can rise up. And status is more important than maximizing profit. And that's very different than modern capitalism, right? Having a good status, being as a group, as opposed to me individually climbing over everybody else to be the richest guy. This is a very different, it's a moral economy considered. You need to have fair price, good product, honest dealings in order to be respected. And that is the best thing. One final thing on this very quickly. This will be a little bit longer video than normal, but it's setting the foundations for everything else. No usury. Usury means loaning with interest. That's considered unbiblical, and Christians forbidden to loan at interest. Again, because you're not charging for labor, you're just charging to loan someone money. So it's not considered honest because you're not charging for your labor. However, Jews could charge with interest. The Jewish faith permitted the idea that, well, I'm loaning money, I'm taking a risk, so that risk should be paid for by some degree of interest. So what happened is the Jews end up being forbidden from most of the guilds, because guilds are considered Christian organizations, right? These are Christian weavers and Christian carpenters. So they're out of the guild. So they get run lose a lot of their ability to make a living, but a lot of Jews can become money lenders, bankers, and which the Christians appreciate because I can now borrow money from somebody in order to invest in my business. But at the same time, Christians then begin this myth of the greedy, dishonest Jewish banker or moneylender. That still sometimes persists to today, but because they got pushed into that, partly because they couldn't do much else, and partly because they were willing to charge interest and make loans. But then the Christians sit there and go, oh, Jews, moneylenders, bankers, greedy. So it's a weird sort of relationship. And the last slide. There is actually a slide at the end, but I'll sort of... Okay, so I've talked about the growth of local markets, and I've referred to the fact that people are moving between towns. This map gives you a good idea that there's a massive international trading network all over Europe as these areas link up, and goods that are available in one part of Europe get shipped to another, and then English wool goes here, and Spanish steel goes there, and amber from the north down here. So there's amazing trade networks that make so this international economy. And you can see on the edge of the map that they're linking up even to the Middle East, North Africa, and elsewhere. So as you're going from the 11th, 12th, 13th centuries, Europe, not just peasant surpluses, towns, regional trade, international trade, a lot of goods, a lot of money coming around. And very, very, very impressive. And finally, with the conquest, you can sort of glance at that somewhere else if you need to. Glance at the Genghis Khan, one of those groups like the Huns, these steppe nomads. He's going to conquer China and most of the Middle East and the steppe lands in the 13th century. And when the Mongols conquer huge portion of Eurasia in the 13th century, they will link up trade from China across all the way to the Middle East and then to Europe in what's called the Silk Road. And Europe's already blossoming international trade networks, which are already linked to the Middle East and North Africa, are now actually getting linked to India and China. It's a long, slow overland network. There's not a lot going back and forth, but they are linked to the East, and they are seeing the goods and knowledge and things coming from the East, and Europe's opened up to a big world, and they're like, wow, amazing. So Europe is linked now to the great Eurasian economies of China and India and the Middle East, and it's growing fast enough that it's participating effectively in international trade networks. Quite an amazing period of growth.